Let's start simple here. And let's say we want to output welcome to the club if the user entered the age greater than 18. If that's what we want to do, then that's something we can achieve by writing a so-called if statement, which is a very important concept or very important syntax feature in Go. For that, you use the if keyword, which is built into Go, and then you write a so-called condition. In this case, we can refer to user age, and we can then use the greater than sign to compare this to another number. For example, 18. Of course, the greater than sign is not the only operator you can use here to do that, to make that comparison. Instead, you also got greater or equal, smaller, smaller or equal, or just equal, though important for equality, you use two equal signs, not just one. One equal sign is used for assigning values to variables. For comparisons, where you want to compare one value to another, you use two equal signs, like that. You can also add an exclamation mark in front of an equal sign to check for something to not be equal. So if user age should not be equal to something else, then you could check it like this. But here I want to check that user age is greater than 18, and hence we can write it like that. Next, you add curly braces, opening and closing, and between those curly braces, you add your body for this if statement. So the code that should execute if this condition is met, and only then. So whatever you put between those curly braces will only execute if this condition here is met, in no other scenarios. So here we can again use the format package and now print a new line where we maybe say welcome to the club, because that's the message which I did want to output if the user age is greater than 18. If the user age is not greater than 18, then nothing will be output. The main function will just finish and not show us anything, since we have no other code in this function. And here actually we could make an argument for checking for a greater than or equal, since you should be welcome to the club if you are at least 18. Because with just greater than, you would have to be at least 19 to meet this condition. So let's convert this to greater than or equal. But of course, ultimately, it's up to you which kind of logic you want to have here and which kind of check you want to perform here. Now with that code adjusted like this, we can save all that code and then of course again execute it to run our module, and then we can enter our age. And if I enter 15 here, which clearly is smaller than 18, we get no output at all. Because as mentioned, there is no code that would execute for that scenario. If I run this again and I enter 32 here, then I get welcome to the club as expected. So then the code inside of that if statement executed successfully. And that's in a nutshell how if statements work. But there is a bit more to it that you should be aware of. Now let's first of all understand which code executes when. As I mentioned, this code inside the if statement only executes if this condition is met. But this does not mean that other code would not execute if the condition is not met. If I add another print message, println message here, after the if statement, where I say goodbye, then this code here will always execute, no matter if you make it into this if statement or not. It's really only the code inside the if statement that is conditional. Code after the if statement will still execute even if you don't make it into this condition. So the if statement and the result of this comparison does not matter when it comes to the overall function execution. That function execution will continue no matter if you make it in there or not. So therefore here, just to quickly show this, with this goodbye message added, if we run this again, even if I do enter 15, we get goodbye in the end. And of course, we also still get that if I enter 32. So that's one important thing to note. Another very important thing to note about if statements is that this comparison here actually produces a so-called Boolean value. And you might remember that from way earlier in the course. Here, on this slide, on the top right, there is this bool value, this yes-no value. I mentioned it pretty early in the course already, but we haven't needed it up to this point. Because Boolean values are mostly useful if you do work with if statements, because they answer a yes-no question. They only contain true or false. And that's exactly what you need for an if statement. If true, then execute some code. If false, don't execute it. And therefore, a check like this, so the check you see here, user age greater or equal than 18, actually returns a Boolean value. This is an operation just as 2 plus 2 is an operation. 2 plus 2 yields a number, 4. User age greater than or equal than 18 yields a Boolean. And therefore, you could also create a new variable, is old enough, where you store the result of that comparison, like that. And then here, instead of performing this comparison just in time, so to say, we could refer to is old enough. Because is old enough, as you see here, holds a Boolean, and in an if statement, you always need such a Boolean value. You could also just write if true, and that would be valid, but it's of course not useful. Because now this code will always execute because true will always be true. That's why you instead use the result of some comparison, like we now have it stored in is old enough. Now we still have a Boolean in there, but it will not always be true. Instead, it depends on this comparison. Now it's up to you whether you want to perform the comparison first and then store it in some variable and then only use the variable in your if statement, or if you want to perform the comparison just in time, so to say. You typically do it just in time, but storing it in a variable can be very useful if you need the same comparison in different places of your code, because you then don't need to retype that code over and over again. Instead, you can then just use that existing variable in all the places where you are interested in the result of this check. It's as always in programming, you want to avoid duplication, and therefore if you have this exact same check in different parts of your code, storing the result in a variable and using that variable instead could be worth a thought, but otherwise performing a check just in time is probably more common, since you then don't need to look at other parts of the code to understand what this if condition actually checks. And therefore here I'll comment this out so that we still have it for reference, but I'll stick to this just-in-time check here. Now, very often when working with if statements, you don't just have code that should be executed when a certain condition is met, but you also have code that should explicitly be executed if the condition is not met. Now, adding such code after the if statement will not do the trick, because this code is always executed as you learned, no matter if this condition was met or not. So if you have code that should explicitly only be executed if this condition is not met, there also is an addition to the if statement that's useful, and it's an addition which you also find in basically all programming languages. You can add the else keyword here, and then again add a pair of opening and closing curly braces thereafter. The code between those curly braces will now only execute if this condition here is not met. So here we could then output another message where we maybe say, sorry, you're not old enough. Something like that. And now with this, if we save this code and we run it, then if I enter a value smaller than 18, we see this alternative message. And of course, if I enter a value greater than 18, then we get that other message. So now we also have a way of running some code explicitly if that first condition is not met. Now, it's also not uncommon that you might have multiple conditions that you want to check and you want to execute different pieces of code based on which condition was met. At the moment, we check if the user is at least 18 years old, and we also have this else condition. But maybe we want to check if the user is at least 30 years old, and then output a specific message, like you're eligible for our senior jobs, whatever, something like that. And we still want to have that else message, but only if the user is not older than 18. But here we're checking for 30. So now we might want to add another branch where we check if the user is at least 18, even if he or she is not older than 30. Because if we didn't make it in there, that doesn't automatically mean that the user is not at least 18. For such scenarios, we can add a else if branch to our if statement. Again, with curly braces thereafter. However, if you use else if, you now also need to add a brand new condition. And here we could check if user age is at least 18. So now, the way to read this and the way Go will execute this is that Go first of all checks if this condition is met. Is the user age greater or equal than 30? If that's the case, this code here will execute and the rest of this if block will be ignored. No other code from that if statement will execute. This code down there, of course, will. Now, if this first condition is not met, Go will go ahead to the next else if branch in this case and then check this condition. If this condition should be met, the code in there, which we'll add soon, will be executed and the else statement will be ignored. The code down there will always be executed. If this condition here should also not be met, then Go will go ahead to the next else if statement, if there is one, because you can add multiple else if statements to the same if block, or to the else statement otherwise, if it exists, and then execute that code. So that's how that will work, and therefore here in this else if block, I'll also print a new line, and here I'll say, welcome to the club. So what I had before as well. But now we have these different branches with different conditions. And hence, if that code gets saved and we execute it, if I enter 15, I still get that you're not old enough message. But if I execute this again and I enter 25, I get welcome to the club. So this else if message here. But if I enter a value that's at least 30, then I get you're eligible for our senior jobs. So that message from the main if check. And that's how you gain a lot of flexibility when it comes to working with if statements and executing different pieces of code based on which condition is met.